you also see how we're doing this to each other. Not you're a bad person. Because the minute you start pointing your finger and blaming the other person, you've already lost. It's about you, not about the other person.
It's time! Work, play, evolve!
I want to connect the listeners to the best of the best. Welcome to the Evolved Broker Podcast. I'm your host, Pat Costello, the co-founder and principal at Evolve MGA. Our mission for the podcast is to bring the insurance industry the best of the best. Family business is a massive part of the insurance industry. Folks in our industry constantly joke that either you're born into insurance or you fall into it. It is very common for older generations to bring their kids into the business or pass their books onto the younger generation. Working with family is tough. So we figured we would bring in the expert who can teach us how to work with family successfully. My guest today is a professor and an author named Allan Cohen. He attended Harvard Business School and has consulted with companies like IBM, GE, and Chubb to improve their leadership, culture, and conflict resolution. He wrote the book, Entrepreneurship in Every Generation: How Family Businesses Develop Their Next Leaders. Finally, he served as a distinguished professor of global leadership at Babson College. Allan and I discussed the recipe for success in a family business, creating a shared family vision for success, how to deal with disagreements, how to deal with an underperforming family member, and how you can pass the business onto the next generation effectively. This episode of the podcast is sponsored by Varuna. Varuna is the future agency management system built on the power of the #1 customer relationship management tool in the world, Salesforce. Varuna allows you to customize your system, workflows, reports, dashboards in minutes. It allows you to gain actionable insights into your business in real time, letting you use that intelligence to grow your business in multiples. Varuna allows you to know your business so that you can grow your business. Please visit varuna.com to learn more. Without further ado, here's Allan. Allan, welcome to the Evolved Broker Podcast.
I'm glad to be here.
I'm super excited to have you, and I always like to learn by learning from the best of the best in whatever category we're discussing. And some of the best family businesses to learn from are part of something called the Henokian Association. Can you describe the Henokian Association for our audience?
Yes, as I understand it, those are companies that have been in business continuously as a family for, I forget if it's 100 years, but some very long period of time. Right. And they have a family member still actively involved, and they're successful.
So you are an expert on family business, and you've studied this topic in detail. Is there any commonalities between the companies that are part of the Henokian Association or just general family businesses that you've encountered in the past that have made them really successful?
Well, there are a number of things that seem to be in common, although I think it was Tolstoy who said all families are not alike. Every family is different, so there's always different characteristics. But there are some things that make a company successful over many years. That's a differentiator criterion. We know that a lot of family businesses don't make it past the second generation, although more survive than is commonly thought. But it's very hard. What
causes that? Is there something that causes the decline of the perpetuation to the second generation?
I think there's several different factors that can get in the way. One is just being in a terrible business. I mean, that we don't want to overlook that you pick something that doesn't have a big enough market, that you can't make money at doing what you're doing. So there can be sort of hardcore business reasons. Mm-hmm. But there are some other things that have to do with the family, that they haven't worked out a way of working together, talking to each other, solving problems, continuously learning and evolving, and they're relying on whatever got them early success. The world has changed, and they don't know why it is they were successful, so they keep doing the same things over and over again. It's like doing a rain dance. It once rained when you were dancing, so you keep dancing, but that doesn't make it rain necessarily.
Right. And you talk a lot about those qualities in your book, Entrepreneurs in Every Generation. And I'm curious because that entrepreneurial mindset seems like it's key for the second generation. But obviously, as part of the second generation in a quality business, you're not the founder. And you may not even have the freedom to operate like someone who is starting a business would. How does someone in the second generation or beyond foster that entrepreneurial mindset to become effective?
So it's a great question, and that could fill up several hours worth because there's lots of complexities, but let me try to get to some of the highlights. The first thing is, for any business to succeed over time, it needs to have continuous innovation, continuous entrepreneurship. It has to be renewing. And renewal can be about the product, it can be about the market, it can be about the processes, it can be about the people that you manage to bring in. It can be whatever the technologies are that you're using. There can be renewal in many, many dimensions. But businesses that don't renew don't last very long. And I even looked at a couple, not firsthand, but through other people's research, that have been in business for several hundred years. And one is an inn in a hot spring in Japan. And it's still an inn, and it's still based on a hot spring, but they're constantly doing things to make it a better business, to make the guest experience pleasurable and meaningful. So on the one hand, they're very traditional. They're not going anywhere. They still have the same mineral-infested water, but they do all kinds of things to make the guest experience wonderful. And they're constantly working around the edges. So innovation can be radical innovation, where you throw out a bunch of something and do it a completely different way, or it can be constant evolution, where you're making minor changes, but together they add up to quite a lot. The best example I know of that is Toyota. Toyota has done some brilliant revolutionary things. I mean, they're a leader in hybrid autos, for example. They were out front, and they're still out front. However, they have a system at Toyota where every single person is expected to put forth new ideas just about every day. And they don't expect the new ideas all to work, but they expect them to come from attempts to do some process better. It might be the way a boat gets put in, or the sequence of operations, or the way items move or are moved to be assembled. So it can be a lot of very small innovations, but everybody's expected to initiate them, and they're judged by peers who have to do the work. And over time, they add up to a lot.
That's amazing. So
yeah, it is amazing. And they don't talk about that, by the way. You can find out about it, but Toyota, I didn't know about it. And for years, I looked at the company from a distance until a friend who worked there told me about how the system worked.
So that entrepreneurial mindset applies to every single person in the company.
That's exactly right. The lowest level employee is expected to be initiating new and better ways of doing things. You can be a janitor and expected to do it, or you can be a senior vice president and you're expected to do it.
Wow.
It's a way of mobilizing all the brain power of the people who work at a place. And that's a good principle, by the way, for innovation. you want ideas coming from the people who do the work, who are most familiar with it. Although sometimes good ideas come from people who are quite removed from the work. And it's only because they're removed that they see things that people doing it every day don't see. Mm-hmm. So you need both.
That is really cool. And I also want to pause on one thing that you mentioned, which is that Japanese inn, which is officially the oldest family business. I know you write about this in your book.
Yeah.
But this family business is 1,300 years old.
They've had some practice.
Right. Was started in 718, passed down 46 generations, maybe 47 at this point.
Right.
But a wild example, if anybody listening to this is interested in historical family businesses and learning from the best of the best. Is there anything?
Let me mention one thing about them and another in like them, which I think is fascinating. You know, the Japanese are quite traditional and hierarchical, and the business passes to the oldest son.
Okay.
Well, sometimes there is no oldest son. There's only a daughter, or there could be no offspring, although usually they manage to have some kind of family. So they have a practice, again, not particularly advertised. If there is no appropriate son, they set out to find somebody to adopt. It might turn out to be the husband of a daughter, but it might be somebody who they get to work at the inn and then they get to observe and they adopt the person who becomes a family member so they don't break the tradition of always using family members. It's pretty inventive, I think.
That's super interesting. So they officially, like literally adopt people.
They literally adopt people.
That's kind of like a cheat code. That's pretty funny though. So if you're the older generation and you have, you're trying to foster that entrepreneurial mindset in the young folks that are up and coming, is there any specific things that you can do to make them feel comfortable and to give them room to innovate and work hard?
Right. So the answer is there's plenty. And I need to talk about it from 2 or 3 different angles. There's the question of how you behave as a family member, as a senior parent, and what you do in your family. And I'll mention some things that families that have made this work do. There are also a whole bunch of things that companies can do, initiated from the top or not, can be initiated from elsewhere. So the answer is there's never just one thing. And I can talk at the most micro level about what that one person who's frustrated because he can't get his father to listen to him, what he could do. Mm-hmm. And believe it or not, nobody's totally powerless. Although I have to tell you about something I experienced. I studied family business in India, which was a really interesting place to do it, as well as growing up in one. So I've had it from both the scholarly end, but also from personal end. And in India, I looked at different size companies and different kinds of companies. And one of the companies was a little engineering firm with father and son. And out of my experience and having done some earlier work with Indian family companies, I developed a series of questions that I asked. And one of my questions was, what should a son do if the father gives wrong advice? I thought that would lead to some interesting conversations. And I asked that at this little engineering firm. And the father said, fathers don't give wrong advice. And I thought maybe I hadn't heard him right, so I said it again. He said, fathers don't give wrong advice. When fathers give advice, it's based on what they know and they're right. Now, I will also tell you that son had a very bad stutter. And the stutter went away when I asked him about it. I said, how long have you stuttered? And he stopped stuttering because I was obviously accepting it and letting him be relaxed. So here they were. There's only 2 people in the company. And the father has the son so boxed in, both engineers, by the way, that the son is rendered almost unable to speak. And yet he's still capable. He can have regular conversation. Now, that was a very extreme example. One of the things that the younger can do is try to chart out what's the pattern in our interactions. And I'll give you an example. It's one of my favorites. I've seen it in many organizations, including, by the way, I actually saw something like this in an insurance company, just by coincidence.
Okay.
Where reciprocal role relationships have developed. That's my name for it, reciprocal role relationships. What I do causes you to do more of what you do, which causes me to do more of what I do, which causes you to do my, we're locked in.
Never ending cycle.
But you can chart it and then say, do you also see how we're doing this to each other? Not you're a bad person. Because the minute you start pointing your finger and blaming the other person, you've already lost. It's about you, not about the other person. Somebody very smart who I studied with once said, when somebody's shaking his finger and saying, you shouldn't do this, start at the tip of the finger and look up the arm and see who's talking, because their values and their style are loaded in. So you have to look at both.
Right. That makes a lot of sense.
So that's what you try to do. Then, if you can get agreement that, yep, we have this pattern, usually it gets both people laughing, because once you see the pattern, it's almost always funny. Oh my God, I do that, don't I? And you do that, and there you do it now, and so on. Then you talk about, okay, so what can we do to create a different pattern? And here, it's not that there's any one special right answer. It's just that you agree on whatever you're going to try. And then you also have to talk about, and what am I allowed to do when you violate the agreement? And what are you allowed to do when I violate the agreement? Mm-hmm. How do we talk to each other? Because we're both going to screw up. Mm-hmm. It's a habit, and everybody falls back on their old patterns. So let's plan for how we deal with the violation on either side. And if you do that, over time, you can begin to build in some new behavior. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So and then that becomes more satisfying.
Right. So Allan, if I'm summarizing here, it's breaking the pattern of the negative communication and figuring out a resolution system for when it happens again, what do we both agree to? Right?
Right. Exactly. How am I allowed to tell you you're doing it? And how will you respond if I do? Will you let me join you in problem solving?
Well, so let me ask you this, Allan. So I totally understand if you're in the mix of that negative situation, trying to figure out exactly what's going on, how we're communicating with each other, why it's becoming negative, and then figuring how to get out of it. But my next question for you is, before you're ever in that cycle, or if you are maybe a business owner and your daughter's coming up and she's just graduating college,
yes.
Is there any way you can start? Let's just say you're not in that negative loop. Nothing's even happened yet. It seems to me that planning, preparation, and creating a shared vision and shared goals in a clear future for both individuals, or as many family members as there are in the business, is the best call. Can you speak to how a family can come up with a shared vision or create a clear future for working together successfully?
Sure. And there are some families who've done it, and a couple of experts who've written about it. But the basic thing is you do some exercises where everybody puts down words on paper that are things they think describe the family or describe what the family values. And then you look at those together and say, are any of these not really so important or germane? Are they just random? Can we get this down to a smaller list? And once we get it to a smaller list, can we agree that this is what we as a family want to be like? What kind of values we want to have? What we want to stand for? Now, I can tell you from a lot of visioning exercises with companies, family or otherwise, it's much easier to talk about getting a vision than it is to get one. Because visions can be glib expressions that get pasted on the wall and then ignored. It's hard to get a vision. So when you're able to articulate one, you need to spend time talking about, well, if this is our vision, what does that mean for the way we do X or Y or Z? You've got to embed your vision in everyday practices and procedures. And you've got to have lots of discussions about, well, suppose X happens. What do we do? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I've had to practice what I preach because I spent 7 years as the senior administrator on the academic side at Babson. And this is now a total coincidence that this example has a Catholic president in it, because we got a president who was my boss, who was a Catholic, a very active one. He'd been senior vice president of Xerox. And so he had lots of administrative experience, but no academic administrative experience. And I observed him for 7 years up close. I worked very closely with him. And it happened that one of his favorite people did something quite unethical. And it's interesting, when this came to his attention, I don't even think he took a deep breath. He said, then he's got to go.
Wow.
We can't keep him. He spent some college money on his own personal stuff when he was traveling. It doesn't matter what. And it was fascinating to me. I mean, I would have been consumed with days of thinking about it and what are the consequences and so on. This was one of his favorite people. He said, that's it. He can't stay.
He broke the code of values or morals.
That's right.
That they'd set for the vision.
Really central to our vision, because integrity is part of our vision. Mm-hmm. So that's what you have to do.
Right. It seems to me, Allan, that there's two big pieces. The first one is setting the vision, ask the right questions to set the vision. But the next huge piece is making sure everybody buys in.
That's right.
Right? Everyone agrees to it.
If you post the vision, it isn't just a poster that's forgotten. It has some meaning, because somebody says when you're up against tough decisions, well, let's see, the vision says we're da-da-da-da-da-da. What does that mean for how we handle this? Mm-hmm. That doesn't always give you the answer, but it narrows the playing field, and it gives you a standard to test your tentative decision against.
I totally agree with you. I think setting the vision, getting the buy-in is key. And I think another thing in the planning process that's huge is setting the guidelines in the systems for when things could get off the rails. For example, when there's a disagreement, and there will be disagreements.
It's the nature of organizations. You hire smart people with different views. They're going to disagree sometimes.
Yep. So is there let's just take disagreements, for example. Is there an ideal system that the folks out there in the insurance world could implement into family businesses, or maybe even situations where there's two partners that have equal interest in the company, and they're trying to figure out what's the best way forward for the company, but they're disagreeing? What system can they use to make that process easier?
It's a great question. And my answer is whatever system they can agree on, because there's no one system for doing it. Some people build in independent facilitator or board member who they go to help resolve deep conflicts. Some have their executive team, and they're so open that the executive team is encouraged to join in talking about. I know a company or two where they even talk about salaries. Now, that's in the United States, that's almost more forbidden than sex. And yet I know a few companies that are able to put it on the table and talk about it and what bonus should each of us get. Mm-hmm. And wait a second, I don't think you ought to get that because remember this, this, and this. Or wait a second, you're not giving yourself enough credit for big decisions. I mean, it doesn't matter which way it goes. So that's one kind of system. Another one is to try to make your values so dramatically vivid and illustrated, each value illustrated by something, that it serves as a guideline. And when you're trying to make that really tough decision, you stop and say, now, wait a second. We have a value that says people will fight like hell for their point of view, but once a decision's made, they'll fight equally hard to prove that they were wrong before. That comes from Intel, by the way. I think it's fascinating. That's their one of their core values. You're obligated to fight like hell for what you believe in, and to fight like hell to prove you were wrong if the decision's made by consensus in a different direction. So it could be that. You could have some ground rules and some places where you had examples. Some partnerships have buy-sell agreements at the beginning before they ever get there. So exactly because they know when they're too emotional, they can't face it. I learned something about divorce, for example, personal divorce. The main reason to have a lawyer when you get divorced is not just because of the legal stuff. It's because if you could rationally problem solve with your spouse, you wouldn't need a divorce. You don't work out the problems. You're too emotionally invested, so you need to have a third party.
Yeah, you know what's funny on that point? I just talked to a law enforcement hostage negotiator who's part of the Black Swan group, and he was saying that when you are in a negative emotional state, your brain is 31% less effective than when you are in a positive state. So he's saying, he literally said word for word, when you're in a negative emotional state, you are dumber than when you are in a positive state. So when you're talking to someone, you want to see how you can get them, if they are in a negative state, in a more positive place.
Right. And look, there's some simple stuff that some people do and works really well for them. They say when we're in a dispute, nobody can speak until they can repeat what the other person was saying. So you make sure you actually understand why on earth the person's saying it, because you give them a chance to fully express themselves. The question, could you tell me the experiences you've had that have led you to that conclusion, can be really useful, because then you say, oh, that's why you feel so strongly about such and such. Well, let me tell you about some experiences I've had which are different. Or, you know what? If I'd had those experiences, I'd also be agreeing with what you're saying. Or at least now I understand why you're taking a position that I couldn't understand before. And once I understand it, it never seems as bad as when I just thought you're being stupid. So those can work. Role reversal. Those
are great examples of systems. And I can tell you what's worked for us in the past, because I started and run the business with my brother. Two major things have been really helpful for us. The first one is involving third parties in one way or another. For us, that means having a system of voting when we have a disagreement on something, making sure our board of advisors are active and they're weighing in when there is a disagreement. And then the other thing is, a lot of times when you're really passionate about something, your ego tends to emerge a bit. And so keeping in mind that that is a thing that will happen when you are passionate about something. So you could potentially be wrong. Taking your ego out of the equation is a huge thing. But then finally, just remembering that we all have the same goal in mind, right? That's a big deal. Right?
Although it's possible to have the same goals in mind and find out that you have some goals that aren't compatible, that you never talked about because it hadn't come up. So it's not automatic, but it helps a lot to keep reminding yourself why you're doing this thing together. What difference are you trying to make in the world? By the way, I'm going to make a big leap and answer a different question, but it's related.
Okay.
You asked, what can senior management do to get people to speak up and stuff? One of the things we know about what makes for innovative companies where everybody's contributing is creating a culture where everyone is expected to speak up, expected to put out their ideas, and expects to be heard. So you build in devices to make sure everybody's heard. I once had a marvelous student. He was a senior military man in India. And he said he had learned when he had a discussion with his staff of a controversial issue, he always had the most junior person speak first, and he went around in reverse order. He said, because otherwise nobody would talk. They all wait to see what the senior person thinks. Now, that's a little arbitrary, but I thought that was pretty clever in a very hierarchical society to structure in that junior people have to first get their points of view out there. Mm-hmm. But there are many things you can do to reinforce the value of everybody having a point of view, mm-hmm. of saying, we won't go forward until everybody says, okay, I understand that and why you're saying it. Until everybody can say, I don't agree with the final decision, but I see how we got there and I'm going to support it fully. Mm-hmm. And a lot of organizations don't let things go that far. They act as if you don't make the decision in the next 30 seconds, the world will fall apart. And so they jump forward. They jump from problem to solution without thinking through options.
Yep.
They don't put potential solutions on the table and say, let's think of the things that could go wrong and how we could prevent those using this method. Let's put 3 good options on the table and then think about the pros and cons of each, rather than just the one that feels, oh, well, this looks like the best, which is not to say that intuition doesn't count or shouldn't be used, just intuition but examined.
One key point you brought up in the book, Allan, is gaining alternate perspective. Like for newer family members, gaining alternate perspective, I think will build their confidence and also help them be looked at in a more respectful manner from other folks in the organization. And I think a great way for people to do that in business in general is to have the younger generation work outside the firm for at least the first 2 to 3 years prior to joining the family business, so that they can experience a different manager. They are more responsible. Can you speak to that? Do you think everybody should do that if they're joining a family company?
Yes, I do. I'll tell you something funny and then give you points. The something funny is I've been saying as a joke, because Babson has a lot of people from family businesses, always has. And I started saying, I don't know, 5 or 7 years ago, listen, we need a one to the left club. Everybody moves one business to the left. They can be in the same industry, but they work for some other family. Then everybody's had that experience and they get just what you were saying, different perspective. They learn different ways of doing things. And something else, which I think is really critical, you gain confidence when you hear feedback outside your own family, because what your family says gets discounted. If it's positive, you say, oh, my mother always thinks everything I do is wonderful. Yeah. If it's negative, you say, I can never please my father or my uncle or whoever it is. Mm-hmm. So working for somebody else, you have to listen a little harder. Yeah. So I've been saying that in sort of a joke. I just read, doing a little homework about you, that you actually have that you have an association where everybody works for somebody else. Mm-hmm. And I have no idea how it works or if it's working well, but I thought, now these are smart guys. This is a very good idea, mm-hmm. because no two businesses do things exactly alike. Mm-hmm. Even in a highly regulated industry like insurance, mm-hmm. there's still plenty of variation. And you get the differing style. Plus, another thing that I think is potentially important, you meet other people in the same or a similar industry. You don't know what opportunities might arise from that. And I write in the book about a couple examples of people who went to work for another family, out of that made deep relationships together, a peer their age, and they started a subsidiary, joint one, that both companies own. And a big issue, one of the great things about family companies is that if you do it right, you can speak more freely than in any other kind of organization. Mm-hmm. And I've met a few families where that's true. I even met a father-daughter combination some years back at Babson. And not my student, just somebody I met at a conference somewhere. And the daughter said, "We're so honest and direct with each other that people who work for us, non-family members, get scared. They say, 'Oh my God, it's going to blow apart. You're talking that way.'" And she said, "No, we say anything to each other because we know that we love each other and we're in it together, same objectives." That's the good news. The bad news is that families fall into patterns of relationship. Oh yeah, she's the smart one. I'll give you a personal example, which is that my door's closed, so my wife won't hear me telling you. My wife is, she's one of three kids, but two sisters who are a little over a year apart. And the older sister was very book smart and ended up winning a full scholarship to Radcliffe. Very book smart. I personally don't find her all that smart, but she's very book smart. Okay. My wife learned early on, I'm the nice daughter. And she actually went for a year to nursing school. Oh, I'll be the nurse and nice. And the people on the faculty of the nursing school said, "You don't belong here. You're too smart to be doing this nursing." She did something else. She ended up with a doctorate in art history and English and taught for years. So she got locked in early by the way the family treated her. And I see it in our own family.
Yeah.
My two brothers and I couldn't be doing different things, which I think are appropriate in all our cases, but each of us chose something that the others weren't doing, so we wouldn't have to compete. And you fall into patterns. That's all I'm saying.
Yeah, you get boxed into that label, to that category
right.
of, oh, it's the smart one, or it's the kind one, or this person's
or it's
good
the one
at this.
who likes sports, or the way, whatever it is. And pretty soon,
it's an identity.
It's identity. It's who you are. And you stop doing X and do more of Y. Mm-hmm. Well, when you work outside in something that's parallel but not identical, you find out all kinds of things about yourself because other people see you as they see you. And if you have a group of companies that rotate these kinds of assignments, mm-hmm. they get used to the notion of giving really straight feedback. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Because they see that their person gets straight feedback.
Yeah, I think having that outside experience and getting that unbiased, credible feedback and understanding of potentially the, outside of that specific vertical within the industry, or like in the insurance world, you could be working at a carrier before working at a brokerage. That was my dad's rule. He was always like, if you're going to work for me, you got to work at least 2 years outside the firm. And funny enough, my brother and I, we didn't end up going down that track. We ended up starting Evolve, but I thought that experience was phenomenal. I think there's really no downside to it. And I think,
however, there's a caveat.
Okay.
You got to say, a good rule of thumb is never take something you learned somewhere else and come back to your company and say, "Oh, but a blah, blah, blah company, they do this and we ought to try it." That's guaranteed to raise hackles at the backs of the necks of people in your company. You can use the idea and you can think of a way to test it, run a little pilot, try to create a little subsidiary, take a new geography and say, "I'd like to try some things out there. And, if it screws up, we'll close it." But don't come back and say, "Oh, at school I learned to do X, Y, Z."
Yeah.
Because the family members resent it.
Yeah, and it's important to mention like in the example that you talked about with the father and son, where it was like a 2-person engineering firm and whatever the father said goes, that's a recipe for disaster as well, right?
You bet.
Not adopting new ideas, not looking at new technology, not being
Absolutely.
open-minded. That's where the ship could sink pretty easily. So it's a combination of the two, of bringing in new ideas, going in new directions with keeping with the values and the real core of what made that business successful in the first place with the older generations.
So let me support something else. I've recommended to people in family businesses to join industry associations, to go to meetings, to visit companies that do something particularly well. And if I had known they existed at the time I started saying this, I would have said, why don't you try to get some podcasts going where you share ideas? So
Totally.
Kudos to you for doing it.
Oh, thanks.
And you get a good audience. I know people must be learning things. That's great. And what's nice about it is you can drag in family members on their time, because you've recorded them. So they don't all have to be available to go off together at once, although it's nice when you do, because nice things happen by being social together too.
Totally. Well, Allan, outside of joining a separate company to begin with, gaining that experience, gaining that confidence, that feedback, is there anything else? Well, one huge element of that, I think, gives people that are non-family members, employees within a family company that are not family members, it gives those people more confidence in your ability to come into the organization and do well. They respect that you work somewhere else, that you were able to be successful somewhere else before you come in the business. But is there anything else that a new family member to a family business can do to gain the respect of non-family member employees within a company?
Every organization has one or two people who know everything about the details. And if you're smart, you get on the good side of that person, because when you need to find something, they know where it is, or they've done it, or they can find it, or they can help you, or they can develop amnesia and not be able to remember. So that's a first part.
If you want to earn respect, you got to give it.
Absolutely. And the second piece of that is outwork everybody.
Love that.
I can't tell you how many young family kids I meet who think that being a family member is a license to take long vacations, long lunch hours, to disappear on your own schedule.
Just makes me cringe.
It's maddening because it's so self-defeating. They quickly get the prince or princess label, and then people write them off even when they have a good idea or they do something good.
Yeah.
So be willing to take on the dirty jobs. Don't be afraid of doing something that you normally wouldn't do. Because
what's interesting, Allan, I am watching my sister go through this, because in the insurance industry, you have a lot of producers that work their career and they build a book of business, and then it's renewing and
they coast.
It's got to go somewhere. That book's got to go somewhere. And so that's why there's a lot of transition to the younger generation. And so I'm watching my sister work with my dad right now. And the three things I think that have really made her extremely impressive in other employees' eyes is, obviously you got to have the respect, but work ethic, making sure you're putting in work all the time. People are seeing it. People know what you're doing. Making sure that you are sympathizing with other folks in the organization. And then at the end of the day, performance. She's in a sales role and she is putting up huge numbers. And so
good for her.
It's something that an employee in the organization couldn't argue with. You know what I'm saying?
That's really fundamental. You want people to say, wow, there's somebody who got something from being in that family, rather than the snot.
Right.
It's interesting. Babson has, I can't identify who, international brothers who are alums who are worth an unbelievable amount of money. And we've had a hard time extracting contributions from them. But independently, in fact, at a family business seminar, I met the daughter of one of them. And I knew nothing whatsoever about her. And it was fascinating. In an hour, I came away absolutely wowed, even though she'd been given some peripheral jobs, but she did them amazingly. And I talked to her a year later, and she'd been given a huge promotion. She was running everything. And I thought, now there's somebody who was smart enough to demonstrate her capacity rather than be the princess, which would have been easy to do. But you can't get respect.
It's, as a new family member coming into a family business, I think you got to be ready for the scrutiny, because you're going to get it from all angles. You're going to get it from the senior family members. You're going to get it from employees in the organization. You're going to get it from vendors. You're going to get it from new clients.
I have some news. I tell every new manager, you're always on trial, especially in the first few months. People watch what you do with a microscope, and they give you tests, and they don't tell you they're tests. They'll ask you what sounds like an innocent question, and then they watch like hawks to see what you say back.
Yeah,
do you ever admit you don't know something? Are you willing to say, could you teach me that? I'd like to know how to do that, or I'd like to understand that. Do you admit when you don't know something? Are you willing to stay late and solve a problem? And people, family or non-family, every manager gets it. And the managers who don't understand that inadvertently fail the tests. Often unfairly, by the way, because sometimes the test is one that nobody could pass.
Yep.
I witnessed one firsthand where a manager died young, and the person who took his place didn't do things the way he did, wasn't friendly in the same way, and he got written off completely. He had no idea. I thought it was very unfair, but I'm just supporting what you're saying even more so. Family or non-family, if you're new, you're scrutinized.
Totally.
So
it's
treat
funny.
it as a trial period.
Yeah. I really appreciate your thoughts there, Allan. It's funny. Family business is portrayed in unique ways in the media, in TV shows, and in movies. Have you ever seen the movie Horrible Bosses? It's a comedy. But Colin Farrell plays probably the worst example of a kid coming up in
be horrible.
Of the second generation coming into a family business. And then the other one is, have you seen the show Succession?
Yeah.
So that's a really interesting one. That, I think, there's just so many examples of what you should not do from the older generation and from the younger generation.
Right.
Is there anything that you took from that show that you're like?
No, I wouldn't say that show. But what I'd say is, in general, I believe that managing and leading are unbelievably hard. And not that many people do it well. I mean, I've made a pretty good side living consulting because there are so many people who screw it up. And I know I spent 7 years as the chief academic officer at Babson. And I say as a joke, but seriously, it's incredibly easier to tell other people what to do and how to lead well than it is to actually do it. When you're on the line, decisions come at you a mile a minute. There are a million stakeholders who think they know, especially in an academic institution, but not just, who think they know how to do it better, who second guess all the time, who watch to see if you're screwing up, who interpret what you say in very strange ways. I once said, when I was new to my job, I was with the chairman of the various academic departments. And we were talking about something. And at a certain point, I finally said, I don't know, this is peculiar. It feels to me like there's ghosts in the room. And they started laughing. And 3 of the old timers said, there are. And they named 3 predecessors who had done things that were authoritarian or arbitrary. And they said, those guys are hanging over our discussion now. And I said, thank God I'm not totally crazy. But I mean, and I think I'm pretty aware.
Right.
But if you don't know that the test is going on, your odds of passing aren't so great.
Totally.
And so, I mean, among other things, if you're new, you ought to be asking for feedback all the time.
Mm-hmm.
How did that go? How am I doing? What do I need to learn? What could I do to make your job better? There's one of the most useful questions anybody can learn in an organization.
Mm-hmm.
Say to the people that you deliver to, whether it's external or internal customers, what could I do to make your job easier or better?
Yep.
What are we doing that's getting in your way? And people have a surprising number of ideas.
Mm-hmm.
And instead of shushing them off, you take them seriously. Over time, you earn respect. Plus, you make their jobs better.
Yep.
What's wrong with that?
Allan, 2 big topics in our industry that I hear about all the time are succession and perpetuation. And we know we go to a lot of Marshberry events there for agencies in the insurance world that are looking to get better. And they essentially act as a consulting firm and almost like a virtual board of directors. Yep. But the valuations for insurance agencies are extremely high right now. And so a common issue that a insurance agency owner is going through at the moment is, should I sell my agency? Or maybe I have a child that's in the business that's doing really well. That is, you know, their sales numbers are off the charts or whatever it is. They're doing everything they could have done for the situation that they're put in, but that owner is trying to decide on perpetuation. If the owner is like, you know what, I think I want to pass the business on to the next generation, what is the first thing they can do to make sure that that passing of the baton goes smoothly?
Well, I would start with a real conversation with that person saying, here's what I'm thinking about. Here's the pluses. Here's why I have the desire to pass it on. But I don't want to pass it on if you don't want it or you don't see that it's right for you. So let's start with talking about that. Let's talk about the pros. Let's talk about the cons. Let's talk about the things you've loved about the business. What have you hated about it? What would make it so that it's more attractive? That's a good starting point. A second thing you might do is say, let's talk about your siblings if you have any, some of whom may be too young to consider this for, but what do we see in them that would make it likely that they'll be interested? And what makes it unlikely that they'll be interested? I told you I had a cousin from the time he was 6 or 7, he knew he wanted to be a doctor. And that was obvious to anybody. I mean, that his whole personality, his whole style, no point in trying to talk him into it. So that's part of it, is bringing that person into the game. And then trying to develop a plan of action. And it might be a short or a longer term plan of action, but it would be, what would be the things you'd have to know to make you comfortable? What would be the things you'd have to know so I'd be comfortable? Mm-hmm. And how could we go about getting those? And those could happen in a million ways. Mm-hmm. You could have shadow assignments. You could have rotating assignments. You could have an internal coach, somebody who's doing it, and over time pay them to give you extra coaching so they don't resent the idea that you're going to get the next role. Build in systematic feedback periods. Do a thorough external evaluation of what you're good at and what you're not good at. So we lay out a plan of action. Talk about whether there's some other education that would be desirable. Talk about who you could shadow. That's what I meant by shadow assignment. Who's doing the job now? Is it me? And how could we work that out? How could we find out from other people in the company what they think you'd have to know to be really good? So we're working from reality, not just from what we think.
Mm-hmm. Ironically, two areas that I feel like people put off constantly that are some of the easiest things to do. Number one is planning, and number two is communication.
Yeah. Well, if it were really easy, people would do it. For a million reasons, they don't do it.
Mm-hmm.
I love the line, how can you plan when you don't know what's going to happen? I think that's a yoga barrierism.
Right.
And,
at least preparing.
And
right?
Bad communication drives me personally nuts. Not that I haven't had plenty of my own, but I always, my instincts always take me to put it on the table. I mean, you're way better off when things are on the table than when they're not. Now, there are some things that aren't discussable for some people. I can tell you, I tried several times to have really serious, deep conversations with my father, not necessarily about the business, but about life and his life. And one time I had him in the car for an hour and a half, driving him to the airport from visiting me. And I thought, I can't miss. I got a captive audience. And I talked for the better part of that hour and a half. And we got to the airport and he said, "Oh, are we here? I had a nice sleep." I have no idea if he was really asleep or not. But
that's horrible.
He was a master at evading.
Oh no!
And there were just topics that he wouldn't talk about for his own personal, things, whatever he had, and drove me crazy. I had a pretty good model in my mother. When we all went back to school, she started working in the store as well as my uncle and father and my uncle's wife. Mm-hmm. And about a year into it, on a vacation, my aunt did something that infuriated my mother. And so she didn't speak to her for 7 years, working in the same store every day. So we saw each other every day. And at family holidays, my mother just cut her out, didn't talk to her. And I thought, how can you do that?
Yeah.
How can you see them? But people have their own things about communication.
They do. But I mean, I think if a company wants to be successful and the older generation wants the younger generation to be successful, they have to be open-minded. They have to listen. They have to have respect, and they have to find ways that they can allow the younger generation to feel heard and to explore.
And to do that better, you might have to ask, how could we do this in a way that will be easy for you to explore? I know that I make you uptight, or I know that these are topics you don't love. But in order for us to be successful over time, we have to get them addressed. How should we go about it? Should we read something together? Should we get a consultant? Is there somebody in the company who you think could help? I mean, engage the person who's the difficult person in the question of how to address the questions.
Mm-hmm. Allan, before we go into our final segment, I have a couple specific questions from your book that I wanted to ask before we jumped off. The first one is, and I've experienced this because my brother and I work together, and my family's all in the same industry. We could literally talk about work 24/7.
Yes.
There could be no off switch, whether it's at Thanksgiving, at a family dinner, Christmas, whatever event it is, whenever we're together, work could come up.
It's a better problem than the other way around, but it's still a problem.
Right. Would you advise setting out specific times where you're not talking about the business, where we both agree, okay, we're not going to talk about work right now?
I would ask other family members their opinion of that, because spouses and kids may resent all that time going into company talk, although that's where they learn. That's one of the ways people learn about their family's business.
Yeah, that's my mom. My mom is she's the only one in our family that's not in the insurance industry.
So make agreements that you'll try when you're with her to not go there, and give her license to say, "Oh, you're on it again," and honor that.
Yep, it's respect.
Assuming you care, right? So that's the first thing. The second thing is, I know that some families find it really useful to have reserve times when company stuff's off limits. I always find that frustrating because I'm not a linear thinker. I'm an associative thinker, and I only think of things when I think of them. So I hate to have a topic I can't talk about because then I can't think of anything else. Mm-hmm. But that's me, and so we work on that. And I've always been somebody who talked about work and non-work interchangeably, weekend, holidays. And I know that sometimes it pissed off my wife. Other times she would join in. She's very smart. She would have an idea, or afterwards she'd say, I heard such and such, and, get into the conversation that way.
Yeah.
I will give you an example from the other extreme. I'm not making this up. I consulted and wrote a case with a company in India, quite large company, with the older brother, younger brother, and a cousin were the three family members in the company. They actually had two different businesses. One was a controlled and the other was an uncontrolled business. So they were all in the iron and steel business. I can even say that much. And I was trying to create teaching material out of that experience. And so I did interviews about their family norms and so on. And in the course of it, I learned from the older brother that, oh, by the way, as is typical in India, they lived in what's called the same compound, adjoining houses inside a gate, right? Senior family members living on upper floors. Yep. So they're living together as well as working together. The older brother told me he'd been angry at his younger brother who did marketing. Older brother was the chief, everything. He was angry at his younger brother for 17 years and he never told him.
Oh.
17 years living in the same compound, riding to work together every day in a car. And I persuaded him that, talk to him. And he did. And what do you think happened?
He probably felt great.
The younger brother said, what are you talking about? I don't remember any of that. Mm-hmm. He had been showing off at a family gathering and claimed credit for something that the company did that the older brother had actually done. That's what the older brother's memory. The younger brother had no memory of doing it even. Oh, okay. And of course, you take that as a symptom of feeling one down to your older brother, who's very smart, very fast talking. To me, it's mind-boggling. I don't see how you could do that.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I know in my experience, there aren't moments where I feel like, oh yeah, we should just shut it off right here, because I think sometimes it's so exciting. It's one of the benefits of being in family business.
Of course.
It's like Christmas Eve or whatever it is, and you're like, I just had this great idea,
right.
And it's so exciting. I think a lot of it is reading the room, making sure you understand where people are, how much energy they have, and some emotional intelligence there.
Do you know the concept of the parking lot?
No.
It's a team discussion device. You are having team meetings and you're talking about topics and somebody says, I got an idea, but it's not on topic or you don't have enough time. Say, great, put it in the parking lot. You keep a flip chart and you put it up there and it becomes the running agenda for another meeting.
Oh, nice.
And it's like, okay, we acknowledge the thing. Now we won't forget that it exists. It'll be up there reminding you. You can flesh it out if you want before the next time we have a chance to talk about it. It turns out that's very freeing. Knowing that we have a parking lot, I don't have to be so anxious that we'll never get to talk about this.
Yeah. If everybody agrees to rely on it, super useful.
Yeah. So, but as I say, different families need different things. Some have on vacation, we don't talk business, or on holiday, we don't talk business, or on Friday night, we don't talk business. And others say, we can go at it anytime. And here's the rule for stopping it. If you're sick of it and want to do something family, just say so, and we'll all put it aside for now and come back to it later.
Mm-hmm. Make it a rule.
Yeah. So it becomes part of your operating rules.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Well, Allan, before we get into the rapid fire 5 questions, the last question I had for you, I think is probably one of the toughest situations that family members have to deal with. But do you have a plan of action for what to do when you're dealing with an underperforming family member?
It's a wonderful question. And of course, it's often extremely awkward. So I think there's a number of ways to deal with it. By far the best is to create a culture where anybody can talk about anything for your whole company, not just family to family, but non-family to family and so on. If you've created that kind of culture, then it isn't as big a deal. You put it on the table and say, okay, listen, there's some things we got to discuss. But if you haven't done that, then it's really hard. Mm-hmm. So that's one thing.
Okay.
A second thing is, do you have any of a performance feedback system? And if you have one, which you ought to have for all people, that becomes part of that. Mm-hmm. You put it on the table and you say, let's look at how you've been doing. First of all, you look at how you've been doing. What's your own self-evaluation? What are you good at? What are you not so good at?
Yep.
Where do you think you could use help? Where do you think you're not getting enough credit? So good performance appraisals always start with the person's own opinion, because that gives you openings to talk about things. If they bring them up first, mm-hmm. all the better. Another thing is the most helpful feedback happens close to the event and is specific. It's much more effective to talk about a particular skill or a particular event than it is to say, you're impossible at blah, blah, blah. Although you might get there. When you're talking about it, you might get to say, seems to me this is something you can't stand doing. Because here's 3 examples where I saw you trying, and you can hardly get a word out, or you ended up pissing off the other party, or you didn't look very happy the whole time. Concrete.
Yeah.
So you try to make it behavioral and concrete. Ask the person if it's something they want to do something about. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So now those are direct ways, which I believe in. I saw at one company, I only saw this once, at a family company. They were quite large. They had some subsidiaries in other countries, and they'd ship somebody off to one of the other countries to run a small subsidiary. And basically, they never said this out loud. Their attitude was, what's the worst you can do is screw it up.
Right.
The second thing that same company did is they would give a person the title of president of a division or of a function and give a non-family member a slightly junior title. But everybody mm-hmm. knew that it was the non-family member making the decisions. And it was a fiction they all went along with. I thought that was very unhealthy, actually. But if their culture was, as Indian culture often is indirect anyway, everybody played along.
Mm-hmm. I think it goes back to the planning and preparation that we were talking about earlier, and setting expectations. So before a family member enters the business, this is the performance standard that everyone's held to. And if performance dips beyond this level, XYZ is going to have to happen, which could involve...
That's really good.
Right?
That's really good. If you have that, that's great.
I think that's key.
Also,
because otherwise that person can float, and then maybe then the expectations aren't even set with the senior person, where the senior person's, well, I don't have the system that allows me to deal with this effectively, and I'm just naturally sympathetic because this is my child.
You know what? You're actually saying something that I would take even larger. Every organization ought to have the chance for every person to learn. So there ought to be some form of getting feedback on how you're doing, even for the top person. And that can be hard, because if there's a little hierarchical feeling and authority feeling, people are afraid to say. So you have to invent ways for them to do it. And you have to demonstrate that when they give you feedback, you don't immediately make excuses, but take it seriously. Your first question is, really? Tell me more about that. Or when did I do that? Or can you give me a concrete example so I can work on it? I mean, people have to see you inviting and being curious and open. And if the top people do that, then they're more willing to listen themselves. Mm-hmm. So I think that's really important.
Yeah.
But I agree. Everybody ought to be able to get some feedback. And if somebody's having trouble listening, that becomes part of the feedback. This seems to be really tough for you. How could we do this in a way that feels more supportive?
Mm-hmm. Agreed.
Because feedback is about learning and growing. It's not about punishment. That's not our objective.
Yep.
We want you to either grow into this or say, you know what, it's a territory I don't enjoy, so I don't want to be doing X or Y or Z. Yes.
It makes sense. It makes sense.
One of the things I tell people is you can say anything to anybody if you frame it in terms of how they can do better at something they care about. Mm-hmm. Right? Mm-hmm. I can tell you the toughest thing about you if I tie it to something that you seem to want. You know, you want to earn more money, or you want to run a division, or you want more direct reports, or you want a chance to travel, or what, it doesn't matter what it is. Okay, let's talk about what it takes to do those things well. Let's look at the places where you do them. Let's do some evaluation, including your evaluation, and let's develop a plan to develop your abilities. And over time, you'll learn how to do those better and you get to do more of them. Or you'll come to say, if this is what it takes, I'm not interested. Or you'll teach us that there's another way, that we missed something. That's always possible.
It's an evaluation that builds motivation as well, because when it's integrated right. and it's based on something that you want, then you can drive the performance that is needed to make it happen.
I always say when you're doing annual performance appraisals, which are touchy, it should always start with the person's self-appraisal. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Either open-ended or on some agreed topics.
That's exactly what we do. That's exactly what we do.
How you doing at X, Y, or Z? Let's talk about it. And by the way, for each of those, what are the things that we do that make it harder and that could make it easier? Mm-hmm. So you don't assume it's all on the other person. I might be part of the problem. Mm-hmm.
So Allan, we always wrap up our conversations with 5 rapid fire questions, and you can answer these questions in as short or as long as you would like to. But
that's dangerous with me.
I think you'll find them to be pretty quick, because a lot of them could be one-word answers or yes or no's or things like that. So to start off, what do you think is the most successful family business of all time? Which company?
I'm pretty impressed with what I know about Michelin, and there's an example in the book. Because they did bold innovation as well as minor innovation. They encouraged people to come up with ideas. I know another one that's really good. Gore, W. Gore, the people make Gore-Tex. I've never set foot inside, but I know a number of people who've worked for them or consulted with them, and I've read a lot. It's a company that is great at encouraging openness and encouraging ideas everywhere. So I think they're fabulous and very innovative.
Cool. Those are great answers.
Those are a couple.
I really enjoy how those are name brands, so people can kind of look into them if they're interested.
I try to think of ones people can look at.
Yeah. Okay. Next question. Do you have a favorite movie or TV show on family business? One
favorite, the name of which I always forget, was set in Detroit in an appliance store. It had so many things that were parallel to the business I'd grown up in that I loved the movie. and it was a group of young actors who were cast in several things, including The Breakfast Club and I forget the other ones, but there were some characters in that who could have been lifted out of my real life. So I like that one a lot.
Okay, cool. So we'll have to try and see if we can find the name of that one.
Yeah.
Okay. I it's funny. My mind when we included this question on our list immediately went to like mafia movies because they're so family oriented. So
they're really good on family dynamics and business dynamics. They are really astute.
Yeah.
So I give those a lot of points.
The Godfather immediately comes to mind as like the number one.
Absolutely.
Okay. So what is the favorite class that you took at Harvard Business School?
One of the classes that was a favorite was a class in which the subject matter of the class was the team dynamics happening in the class. You might have heard of T groups. They were therapy groups.
Okay.
But the class was run in a way that created a power vacuum. So the class members started trying to push it in whatever direction they wanted, and then things unfolded from there. And it wasn't fun to go through, but I learned a ton about the legitimacy of talking about process, which I think is one of the single things teams can learn most from, that it's okay to talk about how things are going.
Okay.
I would put that down for any team. Periodically stop and spend a few minutes saying, how are we doing? How's it going? What can we do better?
Reassess the process.
The process is a legitimate subject.
Okay. Cool.
So that's another favorite.
Great. Yeah. What book would you recommend for leaders to read if you had to limit it to one?
Well, let me take off the table the one that I would tell everybody to read because I wrote it. It's called Influence Without Authority.
Okay.
I think it's the most universal of the various books that I've done and that I've read. I think it's very hard to learn leadership from books, by the way. I've written a lot of them, a lot of leadership books, but I think it's really hard. You got to do it. And that's where you really learn it. Do it and get feedback, and do it and get feedback.
Oh,
and,
yeah.
So I said, I have the joke about what I teach and is much easier than when I actually have had to do it.
Mm-hmm. Nothing beats the real experience.
It happens in real time. There's never enough time. There's always too much coming at you.
Mm-hmm.
And you are part of the issue always. That's the hard thing about leadership. You're always on stage.
Mm-hmm.
You are always in the problem. You don't solve them out there, most of them anyway. You're in it.
That's great advice. Honestly, that's great advice right there. I think
makes it hard,
everyone
but
listening
makes it interesting.
Yeah.
There's no other one book that I would say, if you read this, you can do everything, because you can't.
Mm-hmm.
At best, you can get a way of thinking about things. So, as I said, I don't have a single one that I say, if you read this, you'll really understand.
Yeah, no, you said enough. I think that skin in the game and truly experiencing and then diving in is the real way to learn.
Trying to find a way to extract the learning from your experiences. Some people are naturally good at it.
Mm-hmm.
Some people aren't so good at it. If you're not, get a partner.
Yep.
Get a buddy. Get a person you trust and say, periodically, I want you to sit down and let me have it. How am I doing? What am I doing well? What am I not doing well? If you work for me, how would you feel?
Mm-hmm.
What am I missing?
Final question, Allan. Do you have any exciting plans in the next couple months prior to the holiday season?
I still love learning.
Mm-hmm.
And I never thought I'd retire, but I did, partly because of this and partly because of COVID. And to my amazement, I discover I like the slower pace, but I could still dive in like I did to this. I mean, I did several days I reread my book for one thing.
Mm-hmm.
I thought I should remember what the hell I wrote. That would probably be useful. I say I can summarize the book in just a few words, but it took me a whole book and takes me an hour to give the speech. But here it is, the short version. Everyone expects to be paid back, 7 words, which is a sort of colloquial way of saying reciprocity is alive and well in the world. People do things because they think somehow or other they're going to be repaid. That's why they let themselves be influenced. But how they'll be repaid, the currency they're going to be repaid in, might be favor for favor, might be money, might be friendliness, might be opportunity. You could have an infinite list of the things that people will play for.
Mm-hmm.
And what's leadership if it isn't influencing people to do the things that need to be done?
Yep.
So master reciprocity. Learn that just arguing louder and harder doesn't make something happen. But figuring out how can I help somebody get what they want in order for doing what I want or need.
Mm-hmm.
That's my ending point.
That is
it's a whole book's worth.
That's an incredible point to end on. Master reciprocity.
And of course, it's what selling is all about. It's what insurance is all about.
Yep. Very true.
Yeah.
Well, Allan, thank you so much for coming on the podcast, especially with the recent health issues. I feel like this is an awesome medium to get your influence, knowledge, everything you've put together and everything you've taught into the world in a unique way for a lot of people that have never heard your message or read your books.
Yeah, I'm glad for the opportunity. I really appreciate you having done this.
Well, I truly think, especially in the insurance world, your book, Entrepreneurs in Every Generation, has some really valuable stuff in it for anybody.
Gosh, I hope so.
Yeah. For anybody that's in a family business or working with family members or looking to perpetuate their business, anything like that, I think it's provides a lot of really actionable stuff that you can use to make your just day-to-day much happier and more efficient. And when the conflicts do arise, you know how to deal with them. So,
unfortunately, there's Amazon, which gets it to you fast.
Okay. Well, Allan, thank you so much for coming on. I will plan to talk to you soon.
Good. I love doing this. Thanks.
This episode of the podcast is sponsored by Varuna. Varuna is the future agency management system built on the power of the #1 customer relationship management tool in the world, Salesforce. Varuna allows you to customize your system, workflows, reports, dashboards in minutes. It allows you to gain actionable insights into your business in real time, letting you use that intelligence to grow your business in multiples. Varuna allows you to know your business so that you can grow your business. Please visit varuna.com to learn more.